Did he say I was the topic?
No.
I was kind of wondering what I did, but anyway, my name is Ginnie. I'm an alcoholic. And thank you for inviting me to speak here tonight. Are we set? Okay. I'm going to relate something before I get started, something that happened just very recently at an open meeting. I made a comment, and a couple of other people commented, and then about the third person that commented used what I had said and used my name and everything. They said, I agree with what Ginnie just said, and they went on to explain what they meant. And I'm thinking, that's not what I said. And it really wasn't. They had kind of misconstrued what I was saying, and it got me to think about that. And because I more or less, I know what I'm going to say tonight. I think I do. But I'm not quite so sure what you're going to hear. And I'll give you an example of that. There was a state trooper who was parked by the side of the road. Excuse my voice. And he saw a big old truck driving along, and in the back of the truck it was just filled with penguins. And he thought, that guy can't be driving around with these penguins. And he stopped the guy and he said, look it, he said, if you take these penguins to the zoo, I will not give you a ticket. He said, you can't be doing this. You can't drive around like this. The guy took off. And by gosh, about 2 days later, the state trooper, same place, he sees the same truck coming along, filled with penguins in the back. And he said, oh my God. So he goes up, and the only difference with the penguins is each one of them had a little pair of sunglasses on. And he went up to the guy and he said, look, he said, I told you. He said, I wasn't going to give you a ticket. I told you to take those guys, the penguins, to the zoo. And the guy said, well, but officer, I did. He said, and today we're going to the beach. Anyway, that's what can happen. So I will try to be as honest as I can and so forth, and I hope that I can help at least one or two people. I was just telling Linda and a few other people beforehand that I really have a very boring story. I'm one of those, drank at home and everything. I didn't find myself under bridges or all these things, but anyway, there are probably some of you out there that can relate to that. I was born in New Jersey, Plainfield, New Jersey, in the year 1933, which, if anybody realizes this is 2013, that makes me, I had my 80th birthday in February. So that to me is amazing. I never thought that I would get to that point, and here I am, so forth. My sobriety date is June 29th, 1989. And all the years before that and so forth, I really didn't think I had a problem. I literally did not think I had a problem. I had a good education. I was born, as I said, in New Jersey. When I was 9 years old, we moved up to Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts. And that's where I lived for the rest of my days until I went into college. I did very, very little drinking in high school. And in those days, believe it or not, I mean, a couple of girls got pregnant and nobody said anything about it, and they were sent off and everything. That was hush-hush. And that was about the biggest thing. I mean, we probably had drugs. I did not see them. I didn't drink. None of my friends did. We had a good time. We fooled around and so forth. It was a kind of a different age, I guess. But anyhow, I was the youngest of 5 girls in my family. We had what I would call, I don't even think there is a middle America anymore, really, but we had, I guess, what would be called kind of middle to low income family. I don't ever remember eating steak or roast beef or anything like that until I got out into the world. I mean, we had casseroles and that sort of thing. I loved studying. I was a fairly good student and so forth. I got a scholarship, which I was very glad, because I wanted to go to college, and we really didn't have the money to go for anybody. So all of us, I'm very proud to say, all 5 of the girls did go to college, but they all went on scholarships. And to show exactly the difference in money then and now, I graduated from Boston University. My scholarship was for $1,000 a year. And if any of you know what Boston University costs nowadays, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So I was very lucky. I was very lucky in a lot of ways. When I left college and so forth, I was ready to get going. Once again, even in college, we did very little drinking. There were some people that were drinkers, and we all kind of looked down at it, but more or less it wasn't a drinking school at all. Not the part that I went to anyway. And so I had done very little in the way of drinking, had no idea that it would be a problem. My folks almost never drank. At Christmas time, maybe they would have a thing, they called it glug, the Swedish, big punch type thing, and they'd have some neighbors in, and that was kind of the extent of the drinking. Believe it or not, I grew up, we didn't even have a car in our family. We lived close enough to where my father would take the train into Boston and so forth, and it was a very nice upbringing. I cannot blame my kids, my background at all on my drinking. I had a good loving home. My older sisters thought I was spoiled, but by the same token, I think it was just because my parents were so darn tired by the time I came along. There were five of us in eight years. So, and anyway, so that's just kind of a little background on that part of it. When I finished high school and so forth, went out to get a job, and my first job was in Boston. That was in advertising and so forth. I went from there to Watertown, New York. I worked in a radio station there writing commercials, and it was fun and everything. I went from there out to California. My sister and her husband lived in Ventura, California, and I decided that I would go out there and just try my luck. And in those days, this was about 1955, I guess it was at that time, 56. And it was kind of wide open. The years were over. The Second World War years were over. This was kind of the boom time. We were going to go into kind of a recession, not like what we have gone through now, but we weren't there yet. So things were looking pretty good. And I got out to California, and I went up to Santa Barbara and tried for a job, and I got the job. It was a wonderful job. I was working called KEY-TV, and I was, believe it or not, hired as a production manager. Knew nothing. It was way over my head. But in those days, anybody who had come from the East Coast and had an education and had worked a little bit, I mean, that meant a lot. The television was just kind of starting out in those days and so forth. That's really where my drinking began. And if my sponsee Terry were here tonight, I would say it was California that really was my downfall. But since Griff is here, he can tell her when he calls her on the phone. So she's out west right now. But no, it wasn't anything. It was me. And I guess what I didn't realize is that I drank alcoholically from the very, very first drink that I ever took. I can remember I could drink anybody under the table. That became the thing where I was very proud of that. I could go all night, and everybody else is kind of falling over, and I'm just, let's go. However, there were many, many times, and I lived in Santa Barbara, and I would go down to visit my sister down in Ventura, and I would wake up in bed at home back in Santa Barbara. Actually, it was Montecito where I was living with somebody, and wake up there and not have any idea how I got there. So I had blackouts way, way early in my drinking, so forth. Within a year of working there and everything, it was a fun job. It was very interesting, and it was fun, it was new, so forth. And the television station was taken over by it was bought out by another person, and they brought in all their own people, so there we were, all of us that had just been hired were out of a job. So I decided to come back east. The West Coast, and I know Mary Kay loves it, and is from that area and so forth, and it's a wonderful place, but it wasn't the East, and I was used to where I came from. So I came back, and of course, what did I want to do? But New York City, the Big Apple, I had to get there. So sure enough, I did, and I was very lucky, and I got a good job. I was working for WABC radio and television network at that time. That was a big, big drinking time. And I don't know if anybody have you seen that TV show, Mad Men and everything? Absolutely true. Everything in there is absolutely true. The only thing I don't know if they show it so much is that we used to have 2 and 3 martini lunches all the time. I mean, that was, we'd do half a day's work, go out, have 2 or 3 martinis at lunch, just barely make it back by 4 and everything, and get paid fairly well. And Pete, you're laughing, but you probably remember those days. And it was incredible. I mean, we wasted so much time and everything. I was not in the advertising end of it, but I wrote advertisements for, to get, how do I put it? I sold, our men were out there selling time on television and on radio, and I wrote the stuff when they brought it back and so forth, why they should choose us as opposed to somebody else. And anyhow, but it was a lot of fun. It was also where I met my husband, and he was a freelance photographer. We had a great time when we first got together and everything. He was a great man, as a matter of fact, and so forth. We married within about 5 months, I think it was, after we met each other. I was 25 by that time, and I had gotten a letter from an old boyfriend, and he had cut a thing out from the New York Times that said any female over the age of 25 has a such and such less chance of finding the right man. And he sent that to me, so I thought maybe I better grab this guy while he was there, and I did. But no, he was a neat guy. But what we didn't realize, and so forth, was he was also to become a really, really, really severe diabetic. And he liked drinking, and I liked drinking, and we had a lot of fun for the first 4 or 5 months and so forth. We did get married, and our first child, my oldest boy, was born, it was legitimate. He was born about 11 months after we were married, but and so forth. But it was very interesting, though, because when I went to the hospital and had him and so forth, brought the child home, I could tell that my husband was very sick. He wasn't himself at all and everything. And he went in and he was tested, and his blood sugar at that time was about 850, which is very high, much, much higher than it should have been. And that was the beginning and I felt so bad for him because he had such a great career laid out in front of him. He really did. He was a very, very good photographer and so forth. But in those days, you didn't just take your little camera. You took your strobe lights. You took all these different things. There's a lot of stuff you had to carry with you, and everything. And he was, of course, taking insulin at that time, and so forth. And he couldn't handle it, and everything. It was the beginning of a really, really tough life. And the guy he only lived to be 59, so. You can imagine what it was like. Many, many nights I can remember waking up and having him lying there just covered with sweat, and I'd say, "What's the matter?" And he'd say that they're coming, and he would be hallucinating about snakes or things like that coming all around him and everything. And it was this horrible disease. They have a much better handle on it nowadays than they did then, but this was a long time ago. And there's only one type of insulin. There's about 5 of them now, and it was just a completely different world. So the interesting part was when we were first living, and all 3 children were born in New York City, and everything. And that's a whole different world. It's one I happen to love it. I really enjoyed living there and everything. But it is pretty close to what that Mad Men, what they're talking about. There's a lot of drinking, a lot of partying, and so forth. I can remember many, many nights going out, not remembering coming home and everything, and Dick kind of bringing me home. And at first it was kind of fun for him. It became very quickly, it wasn't that much fun anymore. He finally decided he'd have to give up photography. And we moved upstate to a little place called Clinton Corners. Well, actually it was Stanfordville at that point. And that was in Dutchess County, New York. And that's where we lived, and he started started working with a real estate broker there, and we ended up having our own little mom and pop real estate agency, which is a thing, as Linda knows, they just don't do that anymore. I mean, and it was fun for us. It was just Dick, myself, and we had one other person who sold property with us, and it was a lot of fun. But as I say, you couldn't do it nowadays. Nowadays you have all the multiple listings and everybody gets a percentage and so forth. Then it was, if we sold something, it was ours, and so forth. But so many things happened during that time. We were running out of money. It was around 1974 to 75, IBM, that was Poughkeepsie, IBM, and that's all Dutchess County and so forth. And where did they move? Down here. They moved and they opened up the Triangle, which is now the Triangle up in Raleigh, and so forth. So here we were left in this whole area with just thousands of homes, nobody buying them because nobody was coming in, and it was a rough time. At that time, Dick didn't realize what he had to make a living and so forth, and he finally answered an ad, and it was an ad for someone to come down and to be a overseer for some builders down here in Pinehurst. And they were the ones, as a matter of fact, that built those out on Route 5, the funny little round buildings that are there and everything. And these were the people that were building them. And they hired Dick to come down, and he came down here. And that left me at home trying to sell our house and so forth. And during all this time, the drinking, he did not appreciate my drinking, but I really honestly, I was in such denial, I had no idea, and it was so much easier to live with his illness and never knowing quite what was going to happen and everything, if I was always just a little drunk, is a nice way of putting it, but just a little, I was in kind of another world. And it's interesting because my children will tell me, they have told me many times, which makes me feel good, but they say, you were a good mother and everything, you really were. And I appreciate that, but the fact was that I was a good mother because I put food on the table, I washed their clothes and so forth. But up here, I wasn't with them. I was off on my own little journey, and that's why I say my drinking career was kind of boring, because it was all up in this area. I didn't really get out and do too much. I like to say once in a while, that I traveled extensively, but it was all up here, and, which I did. I wish I hadn't traveled where I wanted to, but anyway, Dick came down here, and he proceeded to make a living and everything. It was the first time in his life he had ever worked for somebody else. He was always on his own, except for when he first started out. He had worked for Life magazine, and that was where he picked up his photography, as a matter of fact, and then went on his own. But anyway, so he's down here, and I'm up there, and I'm trying to sell our house, and I'll never forget the day we had, our real estate office was we were in a very good location right off of the Taconic Parkway and so forth. And this one person had come in, he answered one of the ads that we had, and I showed him some different places and everything, and we got through, talking, showing property, and we came back, and I said, well, what do you think? And he said, well, the one place, what I would really like is, he said, I'd love to buy your place. And I said, well, it's for sale, believe me. By this time we were going into foreclosure and so forth, and did have the place on the market. And he said, I'd like to. He said, but I just don't have that kind of money. I just can't buy it. And I said, well, would you like a martini? And he said, oh, I'd love one. And I said, okay. So I went and mixed up a bunch of martinis, and we ended up bargaining for the house and so forth over those martinis, and we literally gave the place away. We came out $1,000 ahead after paying off all the legal fees and the everything, coming out clean but literally with $1,000 and no home and coming down here. So it was a rough time. It was pretty rough. Then I got down here, and I thought, well, I'll just get a job. That'd be easy enough, and so forth. Well, by this time I was 45 years old, and I was going around, and every place I went to look for a job, there would be this very attractive young female. Yes, can I help you? And I would tell her, and they said, well, what sort of work have you done? And I said, well, I was in my husband's office your husband's, you worked for your husband? And I said, I worked hard with my husband. I had my salesman's license, and so it didn't make a bit of difference. I mean, they just, oh, well, you haven't worked in the last such and such amount of years, and it was really hard. Dick and I, when we were up in we had moved to Clinton Corners, New York by that time, we had been part of a group that started the first rescue squad, volunteer rescue squad up in that area. And so I had taken the EMT training, and he had taken that. As a matter of fact, he became an instructor in it and so forth. So that when we came down here, when Dick came down, he first became part of the Pinehurst Rescue Squad, and he was with that for quite a few years while he was still living there. And then, of course, when we did, and we found a place in Vass, he became a very good member of the Vass Rescue Squad, and so forth. So they were having some sort of to do, I don't know, some little picnic or something, and Dick and I went to it, and it was there that I met a nurse who was working in the emergency room at this hospital. And she said, well, what sort of jobs are you looking for? I said, anything, and she said, well, what have you done? And I was telling her about working with Dick, and I told her about working, having my EMT license and working with a rescue squad. And she said, oh my gosh, she said, we need someone in the ER desperately. And I said, I can't remember what her name is, Karen or something. I said, Karen, I've been to the hospital. I've gone there and everything, and they haven't so much as called back. She said, just wait. The next day, Dr. Jakes called me, and he said, Karen, I think her name was Karen. Karen says that I need to talk to you. And Dr. Jakes at the time was, I don't know if any of you remember him, but he was the head of the ER at that time. And within 2 days, I had a job, which goes to show you that I don't know how much has changed, but it's who you know, actually, and so forth. And it's funny because it wasn't really much of a job. It was secretary in the emergency room, which was, it wasn't that huge amount of pay or anything. But I'll tell you, I was there for 20, what is it? Long time, almost 30 some years and everything, because the benefits were great. And I'll tell you, when I look back on it, I mean, it paid. Of course, my husband had no insurance whatsoever and everything, and that was in 1976, 78, 76 or 78, I think it was, that I got that job. And in 80, he had a really bad heart attack and ended up being sent up to the Deaconess Hospital in Boston because they wanted to have that's a very good diabetic hospital and everything. He was taken care of up there. And I mean, all that stuff cost a tremendous amount of money, and by gosh, that insurance paid for all of it. So I can say that was a job worth having for a long time. But also, it was a really neat job because for some reason, Dr. Jakes and I got along very well, and most of the people there had to work 3 shifts. You had to work the morning, the afternoon, and the midnight, over into the morning shift and everything. Well, I had 2 very good reasons why I didn't want to do that. One of them was my husband. The other one was, what am I going to do? I don't want to drink during the day, and that's going to really louse up things. And it really wasn't, kind of in the back of my mind. And I remember talking to Dr. Jakes and giving him this whole long story about, well, I'd really like to stay there, because I helped him a lot. I would do a lot of his paperwork and so forth. And I said, I'd really like to, but I just can't do those different shifts. And he went and talked to the head person there, and I was very lucky. I was first shift the whole time that I, for all 30 some years I was there. So anyway, that became the pattern, and that's where I was. I would get up in the morning. I'd get up around 6 in the morning, so forth. Dick would be sleeping, and I would get into the hospital open up the ER, and at that time also a lot of outpatient stuff, like for instance the eye clinic over there on Midland Avenue, that was started out with just two doctors, Dr. Tate and I can't think what his name was. Anyway, and they opened their little get together right there and across from the ER and so forth. And the same with some of the gastroenterologists. They had their area there. Now you go to the Pioneer Surgical Clinic, it's like going to the Taj Mahal or something, you know. But and anyway, it was interesting. It was an interesting time. It was also a time when we were getting less and less and less social, because as he was getting less and less able to work. Our middle son was the one that stayed at home. Our daughter had left, and she was still up in New York State. And our oldest son was also, and our oldest son going away to college, as a matter of fact. And but Matt was still at home, and everything. And he was kind of Dick's right arm for a long period there, a couple of years, so forth. Interesting thing is that he's the one that actually saw the least of my downfall, if you want to call it that. It just kind of went over his head. I think it was the last thing that he cared about at that time. But anyhow, things were going on. I had no idea that I was going further and further away from the family and just from life and so forth. I was very careful of my drinking. I'd gotten to the point by this time of hiding it. And the reason why I hid it was because my husband had come to me at one point and he said, I think that maybe, and he said we, of course he drank very little by that time. He said, I think maybe we're drinking too much and let's cut way back. And I said, well, that's a great idea. That's a good idea, So, and thinking to myself, you cut back, I'll hide, And that's exactly what I did. And I had little games that I'd play. I remember I had one of the small, what was it, about mayonnaise jar, about like this, and I would fill it to about here with vodka and everything. Of course, that was Popov or whatever, the least expensive one there, And I'll never forget when I got into AA and some of the really fancy Piners people are talking about drinking just vodka, and they were talking about all these different names. And I thought, what did they talking about? I'd never heard of that. They weren't the vodkas that I was drinking. But anyhow, what I would do is I would fill that thing up, not full because I'm full. That I'd be really bad if I was drinking that much. So I'd fill it about to here, and every once in a while in the morning, if I would check because I had it hidden, and every once in a while there'd be about this much left, and I'd say, "See, there, I'm okay. I left that much yesterday." I was really proud of that. I mean, it's ridiculous, so forth. Another thing that I did that everybody kind of gets a kick out of and so forth, and I don't have if I got away with this or not, but my favorite dessert was chocolate pudding, and I used to love to serve chocolate pudding because I'd have it on, but it was not the instant stuff, it was on the stove, and everything, and I'd put about that much in the bottom of my little thing and then put the pudding on top and then put everybody else's just regular. And of course, every once in a while I thought, I hope I don't forget which one, that could have been pretty bad. But anyhow, so you can see it wasn't very exciting. But one day, it was interesting. The outside of our house needed to be painted. I live in a little old house. We have the same house that we've had for years, and it was built in 1902, so you can see how old it is and everything. And the outside, it did need to be painted. And all three of my kids arrived and were staying and so forth. It was during, it was the end of, the beginning of June and so forth. And I asked Dick, I said, why are all the kids? He said, I'm paying them to pay the house. He said, we're gonna paint the house, we're gonna get it done finally. And I said, fine, And I would go to work and I'd come home and I'd think, well, they sure didn't do much today. And I'd look around. Well, what I didn't know was what they were doing is that they were going up to Chapel Hill and they were meeting with a counselor who was telling them how to do an intervention. And so one night I came home, I'll never forget that. I came home. By the way, it was after I had gone to a get-together. It was a hospital get-together the night before, and I was late. Another girl came to pick me up, and usually beforehand I would have had at least 1 or 2 drinks, but I was late getting home. I hadn't, and I remember thinking, well, at least when we get, it was a banquet type thing, and I said, well, at least when we get to the banquet, I can have, I'll have a nice big drink or something. And we got there, and everybody had started, and somebody said, well, does anybody want one last one? I said, yeah, I do. And they said, well, what do you want? And I said, well, and I'm trying to think, what is the biggest bang for the buck, and everything. And I said, I don't know, scotch, I guess, scotch, and thinking that they would bring scotch on the rocks or something like that and everything. And they brought a big water glass like this, with, it must have had that much scotch in it, and everything. And that was my last drink. Little did I know that was going to be my last drink, but anyway, I know. I came home the next day. My usual time is about 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon, and nobody was there. I was making spaghetti for dinner and everything. Oh, that was another thing that was interesting, was even though I didn't realize that I had this problem going on, I had gotten into the habit of writing everything down because I couldn't remember anything anymore. It would be like, put hot water on for spaghetti, put such and such in the oven, this sort of thing and everything. So I had this thing I was following, but before I did that, I went around and I thought, well, that's funny, I can't find what happened to that. I had a bottle of vodka, and I looked around, I couldn't find it and everything. I said, well, maybe I, finished it up. Maybe I forgot and didn't realize it and everything. I said, well, for once, my husband drank scotch, and I said, well, for once, I'll just have scotch. He won't know, I'll add a little water. And I go in, no scotch. And I started to think, I said, boy, something didn't feel right. And all of a sudden, the kids arrived and everything. It was in my little kitchen that I'm in now. It was about 5 o'clock at night and everything, and I'm starting to get really mad because I'm pretty much know what's going on and everything and so forth. And in walks my oldest son was there. So I'm sorry, my daughter had left by this time. I was going back up north. And then my middle son arrived, and I still hadn't said anything, and then my husband walked in. My husband was a small guy. He was only about, 5'11", something like that, but he was rugged. He was kind of a tough guy and so forth. And he came in, and the tears were running down his face. And I remember looking and saying, oh, for God's sakes. What is, I knew what was happening, and I honestly, I had no feeling of oh, isn't this too bad? Oh, look at none of that. I was disgusted. They were taking away the one thing that I loved most in the world, and it wasn't them. And I knew it, and I was starting to get angry and so forth. And then they started in, and in a lot of ways, that luck really held even more because I don't know how many, there are a couple of counselors here in the room right now, and they know how many of these interventions do not work. They don't work. And so I remember them going through the whole thing, and my older boy telling me, he said, Mom, he said, sometimes when you have dinner, you just sit there and you stare at the plate, and then you kind of go like this with your fork and everything, and I'm thinking, I don't do that. What is he talking about? All these things that I literally was in the dark about and everything. And my and then my husband said, well, listen, he said, we have a couple of options. We can go to outpatient. We can get some outpatient stuff. And my middle son hopped right in. He said, Mom, he said, we'll take you. He said, I'll pick you up every day. I'll take you. And I said, sure you will for the first 2 days, and after. And the only thing I said, I opt for inpatient. And that was about all I said for that whole night. And so the next morning, they took me over, and I met Ted Clark, who many of you knew and know of, and so forth. And he was in the little room that's the chapel there at the hospital. And I remember saying, well, you're all against me. You're all here. You're all, And he said, well, Ginnie, he said, we're going to send you to a place up in Charlotte, and he said it's called Amethyst. He said it's a good place. And I said, well, Ted, and I've never called him Ted, I mean, he was Dr. Clark to me. I was so angry. I said, well, Ted, I said, I'll think about that. I'll just think about that, and maybe in a week or two I might be able to. And he said, Ginnie, your room is ready, you know. And I was so mad. And my husband got me in the car, and they had packed some things. And of course, you know, a couple of men packing your bag, right? You can imagine what the things I had. But anyway, and I got up there, and it was exactly like what they said it was. We didn't get there till the afternoon. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, I hadn't had anything to drink from Thursday night until this is Saturday night and everything. And they told me they'd have to put me in detox. And I said, detox? What do you know? I said, I haven't had anything to drink. And even when I did, and say, well, we had to, and everything. And I'll tell you, that was an eye-opener, because I was right up in detox, and they had about 4 or 5 other people. They did have us. There's only one other girl, and then there were 3 guys, and they were off in there, but I could hear them. One guy was having DTs, and one guy, you know, I mean, it was incredible. And the place, it's no longer open, but it was an interesting place. There was this long staircase going up, and all the detox and everything, and offices were up here, and down at the bottom of the staircase was the cafeteria, and then they had over here all the classrooms and things like that. And so the next morning, they said, you can go now. And I said, well, where do I go? And they said, well, you just go downstairs, get some breakfast, and then one of the counselors will come out and talk to you and so forth. And I'll never forget that walk down there, walking down those stairs and everything with my head hung down low and everything. What am I doing here? And I'm looking at all this, and there were probably 30 or 35 people there, customers, patients, whatever you want to call them, and so forth. I was the oldest person there. I was also there were very few females. There were maybe 5 of us, and all the rest were guys and everything. It was incredible. And I remember getting some breakfast, and when one of the counselors came in, took me into the office, and we went through a whole bunch of stuff, and then, of course, they did lab work and EKG and all this stuff. And I remember thinking to myself, I'll tell you what, if that lab work comes back, if there's anything wrong at all, or if there's anything wrong in my heart, forget it. I'm going to go back to drinking. And of course, it all came out perfect, wouldn't you know? And so forth. But the second day that I was there, I remember going by myself and walking outside and walking around this lake. And the counselor came out, and she said, I'm sorry, it was a man, and he talked to me for a while, and he said, you know, do you realize that this may be the only time in your life that you will have 28 days to concentrate on yourself? And I said, wow. And that made a lot of sense, because I'd spent a lot of years with a very sick person and so forth, and it can take you down a lot. And it really woke me up. And from that day on, I loved the amethyst. I just loved it. I got along very well with the people there. The guys, the young guys, were wonderful to me. I mean, they just kind of took me on like their mother or something like that, and we did really well. When I got home, as a matter of fact, the first meeting I came to was in this hall when I came home, and that was June 29th of 1989. And the most interesting thing happened was I came in, and a girl was supposed to be my sponsor, and that never did work out. I mean, I don't even know who she was. She never did show up. She was supposed to meet me here. But Dick had brought me, and by gosh, do you know that the person who was speaking that night was one of the nurses that I worked with in the ER. And I had no idea that she had a problem. She had no idea that I had a problem, and so forth. But that's one of those little things that happen in AA. So I can't believe how the time has gone, because I was going to tell you all these wonderful things that have happened to me since since being in AA. But to tell you the honest truth, I had a really hard time in this program. I didn't think of myself as being arrogant, but I came in, I was 56 years old when I came in and so forth, and I remember walking in here and thinking, you know, I've had a good education, I've lived a long life, what can these people possibly teach me? I mean, you know, what can they teach me? They don't know my family, they don't, you know, it was beyond what I could comprehend. And it was so interesting. I remember I went up to Rhinebeck, New York one time. I was up near where my kids lived, and I wanted to go to a meeting. So I went to a meeting there, and I came back here, and I was talking. By this time, I had my second sponsor. My first sponsor was a very calm, sweet lady who just told me she kept saying, all she said was, you're healing, you're healing. And I said, I know I'm healing, but it was really all she could get through to. But my second sponsor was a very different sort of person, the one that I have today, as a matter of fact. And when I got back, she said, what are you angry about? I said, do you know, I went to that Rhinebeck meeting, and I walked in there, and I said, those people didn't know me from Adam. That could have been my first meeting and everything. Nobody asked who I was. Nobody said, and she said, well, what'd you do? And I said, well, I left. And I left before I had left my dollar, too. And she looked at me and she said, Jenny, did it ever occur to you to put your hand out? I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, did you make an effort? And I said, well, no. And that was the first time I really thought about that. And I said, yeah, that is true, And that was, if it was from that little incident where I learned to open my ears, open my eyes, and so forth. And I can't tell you what I have learned, everything that I believe or that I know to be true and so forth, I've learned here in these rooms. It's absolutely amazing. You don't know where it's going to come from, when it's going to happen, but it just seems to happen. And it's always, I don't know, it's miraculous to me. I did everything wrong in the beginning, everything. And it still has been coming out wonderfully. My husband did pass away very shortly after I was in the rooms, and then my first sponsor passed away, and then my next sponsor's husband passed away in almost the exact same way that my husband had. So there were some times there where it was very traumatic, but we all got together and got through it. And that's really what this program is about. I can't tell you how much I love the program. Now, I think that service work to me is an amazing thing, and I know it was mentioned before about the next Saturday is intergroup. The intergroup is something that I've taken on, and I love it. I actually, for some reason, the rest of AA I didn't do too much, but I've actually been in the intergroup since 1990-91 and everything, and it's changed tremendously. And in those days, I mean, we were lucky to have one little recording on the phone, and you would answer, you'd call and you'd get the answering service there, and the little recording would tell you where the one of 5 meetings was, and everything. So it's gotten, and now with this recording and everything, it's amazing. So if any of you, please, if you want to do any service work, that's a wonderful place to come to start. And you don't have to have 40 years of sobriety. You can have 1 day of sobriety, and still we want your input there. So I think that's about all I have to say. I do appreciate being here. This room brings back a lot of memories and so forth. There were some wonderful people that have come through here, and I think of Douglas. I can't tell, a lot of you do remember. I know Donnie does, and so forth, and Mac, and you could go on. I remember one day I sat down just kind of for the fun of it, and I wrote down all the people that I knew that had passed away that were in AA, and it was over 40, if you can believe. So, it's amazing. But each one of those people brought something amazing to the program, and I can't say enough about it. I love AA now. I couldn't say that when I walked through the door, so if there are any of you that are out there, if it's your first day or so, keep coming back. And the other thing that I think is really, really helpful is to get yourself a sponsee. If you are, have had some time in the program, or even without. I remember the first, as a matter of fact, that's funny, I'll just tell you very briefly, the first person that I sponsored was somebody who had been in before and everything, and then she came back, and I was very kind of tentative, and I said, well, okay, I'll sponsor you and everything, and boy, she just ran rings right around me and so forth. She finally came to me and she said, she said, this isn't working. She said, I can tell you exactly what I want and you believe it. And she said, it's all so much, and she went out and did drink again and everything. But it was a good lesson to me. It was a very good lesson. So, but since then, that's about the only person I've ever had that I didn't learn from. And I just think sponsorship is an amazing thing. So anyway, I hope to be here many more years to come. And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.